In this episode, we are joined by Dr. Christine Lee, a clinical psychologist who launched her podcast back in 2021, and she has been crushing it ever since. She's here today to help you identify what is getting in the way of you starting or growing your podcast, and how to move through that inner resistance that we sometimes feel on our journey to becoming who we really want to be and doing the bigger things in life that we really want to do. So if you're someone who's been putting off starting your podcast out of fear that it's not going to work out, or if you've got a podcast right now that just isn't growing like you want it to yet, then pay close attention because this episode is for you. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. Christine, welcome to the show. I am thrilled for the conversation that we are here to have today. Thank you for making the time.
Courtney, it's so great to see you again and to be working with you again, to be in your orbit again. And thank you for inviting me on the show.
Of course. Well, you launched your podcast with us back in January of 2021. And it's amazing to think back at how much has happened since then in a short span of time. But for those that don't know you, tell us a little bit about you and what your podcast is about.
Lovely. Thank you so much. My name is Dr. Christine Lee. I live in New York. I have been a clinical psychologist for 25 years, going on 26. I think this is the year that is true. I have enjoyed my career as a psychologist, and I decided way back when, more than 10 years ago, to take my interests in helping people thrive online because I knew that I had a big impact to make. I knew there are a lot of people who needed what I do. And the online world was really starting to kind of expand more than a decade ago. But I think I jumped in pretty early. I think as a psychologist, I felt like I was doing something really kind of unusual. And what I do is I help people to get past their resistance to doing the things that they want to do. That's the short way of describing what I focus on. And the real term is procrastination, although I find that some people really do not like to use the word procrastination to describe themselves or even to see what is going on. So I tend to teach it in many different ways, including habits, including resistance, including more recently helping people to get rid of their physical clutter, if you can believe it, because interestingly enough, clutter is really this outward symbol or sign of the internal delay and the avoidance and the seeming inability to move forward. And I've had a blast online. I've had a blast creating and nurturing and sustaining my podcast, which is called Make Time for Success. And I have Courtney to thank for its existence. Truly, everyone listening, listen up, because Courtney made that process of deciding to do a podcast and getting the big girl pants on and then birthing it into the world so easy, as if it was like throwing a party. I mean, it's a little bit complicated, but basically it's totally fun. That's what's coming to mind when I remember what happened so many years ago with Courtney and her program and the community of students that were lucky enough with me to be her first clients. So I have loved podcasting. I seriously advise anyone listening today who has an inkling of an itch to do this, to go for it, and certainly use Courtney as a guide.
Oh, Christine, you're putting such a big smile on my face and in my heart right now. And I think back to those early days. For me, I had launched my podcast just a few months before you guys entered my orbit. And what happened was, because my show grew so quickly, people were saying, well, what did you do? How did you do that? I want to launch. And then this is when we were all locked in our houses in 2020 and we had nothing else to do. So we're all thinking what can I do with this extra time? So thinking back to that moment, Christine, prior to you launching your podcast, what were some of those unmet desires that you had that caused you to want to start a podcast in the first place?
I liked podcasts myself. I was a really frequent consumer of podcast content because I had, before COVID, an hour commute and an hour commute back from my private practice office in Manhattan. And so I just felt like I probably acquired enough knowledge from podcasts to get a whole other PhD. And I really respected the vehicle, the opportunity, the ease of learning and disseminating knowledge from podcasting. So I knew it was a solid delivery system. And after that, it was just connecting with my raw, very natural desire to make a bigger impact in the world. So it just made sense to me that podcasting would be a very good, reasonable avenue to try. However, when you talk about unmet desires, there are, let's say, neuroses that come up when one considers becoming a podcaster. And I think you and everyone else who has a podcast or is thinking about having a podcast has run into this. I do not think it is skippable because there are the factors of what will it be like to actually have this be live and available to the public. And all sorts of things come up. And immediately it presents this kind of emotional wall that you do not want to cross, or you don't feel like it's possible to cross, one or the other. And both are very problematic to getting started, which is why getting into a community of people, having expert support, knowing that you have the best route through is such a smart thing to do. And so for me, I'm an expert in procrastination. There are many ways in which I'm an expert in procrastination, including my own natural ability to make things more complicated than they need to be and to delay things that I want to do. So I was facing that. And very coincidentally, I had two very close girlfriends who are not entrepreneurs, who were connected to the podcast world. And they were both just waiting for me to launch and saying, this is really very doable. They were my voice of, this is not as complicated as you might be making it. And I was lucky to have that experience. And I joked at the time that if I had to name a podcast, it would be 4 years ago or something like that, to indicate that I had waited about 4 years before actually saying it's go time. And, I could say I wish I hadn't waited that long, and we all do that kind of a thing, but I had to go through my own process to be ready. Perhaps COVID had to happen for me to actually sit down and do a concerted effort like this. But I'm, again, very, very grateful that that moment did come and I broke through that emotional wall.
Well, it's so interesting to think about because of the work that you do, noticing that inner resistance that came up for you that was there for 4 years, but then also that being, in a way, the very reason why you do what you do and why you help people because you know it so well. I feel like for so many of us as experts, we come from a place of experience. Yes, there might be book knowledge. Yes, there might be degrees attached to that. And in many cases, there are. But a lot of times it comes from that inner knowing that can only be found through experience. And I think it's safe to say that was true for you. I know it was true for me. And I'm curious, Christine, what do you think would have happened had you not started the podcast? Let's say it was now 8 years later and you still hadn't started the podcast. Where do you think you would be?
Oh, wow. My first thought is that I know I would feel silly because 8 years, that's a long time in online time. And I feel that would be a massive missed opportunity. So when people, I'm going to go into general therapy advice here, coaching advice, that when people delay, typically they are only thinking about the starting line and before that period of time. And they fill that space, which is just a space when you think about it, with thoughts of how complicated, how expensive, how not possible, and how inconveniencing things are going to be. And I've noticed that when people think about getting married, when they think about having children or trying to get pregnant, and launching a podcast and writing a book. There are certain things that fit this kind of framework. But what I know from having lived out many of the experiences, actually all of the experiences that I just listed, that people forget and people are not inclined to calculate all of the benefits that will come to you automatically when you cross the starting line. And I'm really glad that I'm not at that 8-year point thinking, wow, what if I had? And so many things have opened up inside of me because I pressed publish. And I think the hardest thing about podcasting is pressing publish. The rest is just kind of to-do list things and a bit of creativity and a bit of fun. But the hardest thing is getting to publish.
It's so true. And that publish button can feel so intimidating in a lot of ways as well because it brings up all of these things in us. It magnifies our self doubt in a way. I know for me, I overthought my show for 9 months before I started. It literally felt like birthing a baby when I finally did start it, and it's like, okay, bringing this into the world. But then you get into your rhythm. And then, now here you are 4 years later. I follow your show. You have never missed a week. You were so afraid initially of being like, oh, the tech. And I remember this. You were like, I don't know if I could keep up. And here you are. You've never missed a week. So can you tell us a little bit about what that process was like of crossing that starting line for you? And then how specifically did you overcome some of those challenges that many of us do face as we begin and prepare in our minds mentally, especially to start a podcast?
I want to say that I credit you with just about 100% of that answer. And if I were going to scale it back to 95%, I would say it was a little bit, we're all starting from internal desire. I don't care what school of thought you're thinking, because we wouldn't be doing a podcast if there wasn't some kernel of internal desire. But I also think it was being able to see myself as someone who could participate in a community of podcasters. And that was what you were doing with the birth of your course and program. And of course, I met some wonderful, very talented people, all of different expertise and age and life experience. And I realized we all have this unique message to share, or at least the people who are in this category of listening to this podcast of yours. We all have that. It's already set. The podcast is just making it public. So it doesn't change who you are. It kind of magnifies what you're doing, and it activates a lot of what you're doing because it really does give you that broader reach right away. And your authority comes out because you press publish. I really do think that. I really do say that to people, even when I'm not being interviewed by a podcast coach. I say, this is a sign of your authority. And I think I benefited from that. But I'm very proud of the fact that I have not missed an episode, that I have produced good content, except for maybe one episode. And that people have off and on messaged me and shared with me that they really enjoy the content, that they really benefited from the content, that they re-listen to the content. It's all such a joy. It's really a very joyful practice to get into. I would say, I told Courtney before we pressed record on this episode that, there have been some weeks where I've done the scramble to get the episode in on the right day and on time. But the rest of the time, it's just a process of let's put this together. Let's think about what's the next most important thing to say. Let's try to help more people. Let's try to attract the right people for us. And let's keep going. And it really feels like just a fun friend, a fun activity, and something, again, I really, really enjoy.
Well, the perspective that you bring to it is so evident, both in the work that you do and in your podcasting and in the way that your podcasting journey has played out through the years. And I like to think of how you mentioned that kernel of internal desire for you now has become a hot burning fire, right? Like that, and it's amazing to see. And I'm curious to know, how would you say that now having this podcast here, looking over the last several years, how has that positively impacted your business? And how would you say it's positively impacted you as a person?
It has definitely been a plus for my business. As I mentioned, just that buildup of my sense of myself and the sense of authority. And I will share that I know that I have gained clients just from someone listening to one episode. And that's a pretty quick conversion mechanism or technique, because I wouldn't have thought that that was really would be enough. My episodes are short. They're not elaborate. My marketing techniques could use more tweaking, I would say, and sharpening up. I am working on that currently. I think when you're in podcasting for as long as I've been, you really start to think, okay, let's really start maximizing the power of what I'm doing and the fact that I've proven my presence and my devotion to this material and this audience. And so that's where I'm at. But I feel that it actually is going to get easier and easier for me to attract the right person. I also have to hold myself to that standard of saying very boldly, very clearly who this is for and who I'd like to work with and what working with me will do for the person who is considering. And it's all a dance. It's all a dance. So whether you choose podcasting or some other vehicle, you're still going to have to do this dance if you're an online business owner. And so the doubt and the resistance and the avoidance and the pretending you don't have a message somehow, or overemphasizing the work of your interview subjects over yours, none of that is really, really going to serve anyone, because in effect, you're hiding. And by being just shy of the starting line, you're also hiding. Again, with all empathy, I'm saying that all empathy in the world, because hiding has its benefits. But I want to promise you that you're going to see so many more benefits, just like when you birth a child, after you do that thing that scares you the most.
We could drop the mic right there, Christine. That is so spot on. And, this reminds me back in episode of 184 of your podcast, you spoke about the be, do, have model. And this is a model that some people listening might be familiar with. Other people are like, what did you just say? Be, do, have? What does that even mean? So I'm curious, for someone who might just be getting started in their podcasting journey, or be there on the cusp of wanting to press publish and actually cross that starting line, or maybe for someone right now who's listening who's actually struggling in their podcasting journey, talk to us about, why is this model so important? And if you had any advice for them on their journey, what advice would it be?
Okay, so to explain the be, do, have model briefly, you have to be the person that you're desiring to be in the moment before you think you've arrived. And what I would say most people make this mistake of doing is thinking, I have to do the work. I have to do the work because before I can be the person. And that way will likely work as well, but it will likely feel more like an uphill climb, and it will likely be peppered with back and forth movement, because your identity as that person that you're desiring to be will be wobbly. You will not necessarily trust that you're going to make it to the finish line, that you will arrive at that new identity. So when you adopt that, I am being that person at the starting line or before the starting line, then you have the benefit of that awareness, that creativity, that authority before you even start. And so I really appreciate Courtney's bringing up the concept of be, do, have here, because it absolutely applies to podcasting before you start one, as you start one, and after you've created and launched your podcast, because every podcast episode requires a be, do, have mentality of, I'm creating something brand new and putting it into the world with just trust that it's going to fly. I mentioned that I had one episode that really, I think, was just probably subpar. And I can't really, it wasn't running out of material. It was probably that week. Something was probably happening that week. And I just said, let's go. Like, we're just going to keep steady instead of skipping a week. And these things happen, but I made that decision from, I'm owning this. I am the boss of this. I'm responsible for this. It wasn't like I'm giving up. This sucks. The whole thing is going to collapse, because that wouldn't be the identity of a successful podcaster. A successful podcaster understands that there are going to be episodes that kick it and get a lot of downloads, and then episodes that you think are fantastic that nobody listens to or very few people listen to. And one podcaster friend that was another force of me starting and pressing publish said to me, Christine, just put your head down, do the work. Don't watch the download numbers. Of course, I watched the download numbers, but I got her message, which was, you know what? It's the work that's important, the quality of what you produce that is really going to make the podcast. And when you put your head down and do that work, it's going to grow and it's going to make an impact. And I trusted her. I always will. And it's carried out.
Well, Christine, hearing you walk us through this model is such a good reminder for me. It is so true at every level of our journey. It's something that we have to continually step into, because if we want to reach that next level of success, it's going to require us to become someone that we are not currently and that we have to then begin to embody. And you explained it so beautifully, especially as it relates to podcasting. And it's been such a joy for me and such an honor for me to witness your journey as a podcast host over these last several years. You've overcome so much to get here. And I'm so grateful for you making the time to be here today to share your wisdom with us.
Well, thank you, Courtney, again for being the root, the gardener, the waterer, the facilitator, the woman with all the templates and the spreadsheets and the support and the wonderful attitude and leadership that you just emanate and very naturally. So I appreciate you. I appreciate this journey. I appreciate what you said about my growth, because, kind of like having a baby. You kind of forget all of that angst you had before when you're 4 years down the road. When you have a 4-year-old, you're not thinking, oh, wow, I just really didn't think this was all possible back then. You forget. But I would say get to that point where you've forgotten all of your nervousness about doing this thing. Get to the point where you're being the successful podcaster. It's great.
Oh, you're amazing. Thank you, Christine.
Thank you. Right back at you.
I don't know about you, but I want to go back and hit replay on everything Christine just shared, because even though we all know that we're the ones who can get in our own way, what we often don't know is what to do about it or how to work around it or to work through it. Luckily, there's a podcast for that, and it's called Make Time for Success with Dr. Christine, and we've linked to it in the show notes for you, so be sure to go check that out. Then don't go anywhere, because in the next episode, we have got a very special guest and top podcast expert joining us, who I had the privilege of sharing the stage with at Podcast Movement, and he's going to be here to teach you how to engineer a recommendable show that grows via word of mouth. That's all coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.